Hello, everyone. Welcome to Siyum Masechet Shekalim by Hadran. We're very excited to see you all here. I think we're ready to get started. Let me just go through what we're going to do today. We're going to finish the last Daf with Rabbanit Michelle Farber. I just sent a link in the chat where you can find the Safaria as well as the study guide that we'll be using. We will then have a very exciting Siyum HaShas by Shari Mendes. And after that, we will hear from Rabbanit Yael Leibowitz, who will be speaking about Inheritors of the Lost Ark. And so we will begin with Rabbanit Michelle Farber.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. As always, great to see you all. We saw you a few weeks ago and fun to see you all so soon after. It was a short Masechet, but definitely quite a challenging one. Certainly getting used to the Yerushalmi, the language, the cutting off in the middle, the lack of clarity of a lot of the text. It was definitely a bit of a challenge. I hope you all enjoyed, though, all the other elements of the Yerushalmi, which definitely were a little different than the Bavli, all the interpersonal relationships, etc. With that, we will get started. Today's daf is dedicated by Shari Mendes in honor of her Siyum HaShas, which is very exciting that we get to celebrate that together with all of you. It's dedicated in memory of her father, Martin Greenwald, and Rav Ronen Neuwirth, Zichrono Livracha, who passed away just this Pesach. Both had a lasting influence and meaningful effect on Shari's learning and completion of the Daf Yomi cycle. Shari will speak more about them in her presentation. Before we start, I also want to thank Serene Shanis and Harold Tribert for dedicating Masechet Shekalim in memory of their parents. Masechet Yoma is still up if somebody wants to dedicate it. And with that, we will get started with our daf. So we're going to start at the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet with a Mishnah. We're going to learn through 2 Mishnayot today, and with that, we will finish our Masechet. I recommend, you can go on to today's daf post. The new post is up already. It's up with the Siyum. You can find there's a sheet today. I did a sheet. I even worked on doing it in English. For those who I know have asked for it, I can't get it to it all the time, but once in a while in a Siyum, we can get to a daf in study guide in English. I'm going to pull it up to see as I teach so that you can see it here. Okay, we're now going to start with our daf. Mishnah starts with Basar Kodshe Kodshim Shenitma. The last Mishnah we saw was about a parochet that was nitma, that became impure with a vlad hatuma, which we said was, the way we described it in the Mishnah was a vlad hatuma is a derabanan. Okay, it's usually, in this case, we talked about that it was a liquid that then kind of jumped up a level by rabbinic level. I'm not going to get into all the details of purity and impurity. But now we're going to talk about meat. Basar kodshe kodshim shenitma. Now we're talking about food. Food, we all know, can become impure. Maybe we don't all know this for those who are more new, but food can become impure by any kind of level of tuma. Certain levels can't. Like, for example, the parochet generally can't become impure by things other than an avatuma, one of the highest levels. But food can become from an avatuma, from a Rishon Latuma, which is the next level, the first degree, and then a second degree from a Sheni. So Basar Kodshe Kodshim Shenitma. Bein ba'avatuma, bein bevladatuma, bein bifnim, bein b'chutz. We're now going to discuss what do we do. Before I even continue reading, I want to just say, what do we do with meat? We have meat that becomes impure and it's in the temple. Now, the general rule is we want to keep all impurities out of the temple. On the other hand, we have another issue, which is we're supposed to burn. We're now talking about kodshe kodshim, which is meat that's supposed to be eaten in the temple. If it becomes impure, it's supposed to be burned in the temple. So it's a little bit strange because on the one hand, we want the stuff out of the temple. On the other hand, it has to be burned in the temple. So the Mishnah says, we're now going to have classic Mishnah, not really classic. We don't usually have so many opinions, but more classic even for the Gemara. We're going to have, as you see, are 4 different opinions. Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, sorry. And we're now going to see there's 4 different options here. Okay, I'll go through it on the chart first so you see it and visualize it to make it less complicated. Nitma ba'avatuma b'chutz. We're going to have things that became impure from an avatuma, which is a high-level tuma, outside the temple. Then we're going to have nitma ba'avatuma, high-level impurity, inside the temple. Then we're going to have nitma b'vlada tuma, which is a secondary source. That's already not an avatuma. It's something that became impure from the avatuma. It's only what we call a rishon l'tuma, and it's going to turn that food into what we call a sheni, a second degree impurity. So this is from a secondary source, and it's outside. Then we're going to have nitma bevlada tuma inside. Okay, so avatuma is always going to be more strict. When it happens inside, it's always going to be a little more likely that we'll actually burn it inside rather than something that became impure outside, which then means in order to burn it inside, we're going to have to actually bring it into the temple. And we don't want to be bringing in impure things into the temple. So that's going to be our toss up here. And as you can see from the chart, there's all different kinds of options here of what people say. So the first opinion is, it doesn't matter whether it's an avatum or a vlada tuma, bein bifnim, bein bachutz. It doesn't matter whether it's inside or outside. Beit Shammai omrim hakol yisaref bifnim. Beit Shammai says, until they say otherwise, but right now, everything gets burnt in the temple because we have a halacha that you're supposed to burn things in the temple. But chutz mi, one exception, shenitma ba'avatuma bachutz. If it's high level tuma and it happened outside, we're not going to bring that high level impurity inside the temple. Next, Beit Hillel omrim, second opinion, hakol yisaref bachutz. They're the opposite. To keep everything outside the temple. We don't want any impurity getting into the temple unless it's nitma chutz mivlada mishnitma bivlada tuma bifni. It's a lower level impurity and it's already inside. So since it's already inside and it's already a lower level impurity, we're going to let you burn it inside. So those are the two different approaches of either try to keep everything inside or try to keep everything outside. Now we're going to have two other opinions. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, shenitma ba'avatuma, bein bifnim, bein bachutz, yisaref bachutz. If it became, okay, now we're going to go by not inside, outside, and we'd rather keep everything out or rather keep everything in. But now we're going to say it all depends whether it's high level, low level. If it's high level, we're going to keep it outside. Avatuma doesn't matter whether it started, became impure inside or outside. We're going to take it outside and burn it outside. Yisaref bachutz. Shenitma bivlada tuma, bein bachutz, bein bifnim, yisaref bifnim. Once it's that lower level tuma, I'm specifically, by the way, saying higher and lower level because we're going to have a debate in the Gemara. What exactly do we mean when we say avatuma, and what do we mean by vlada tuma? We're going to see there's a bit of a debate about it. So if it's nitma bivlada tuma, no matter what, it's a lower level tuma. Bein bachutz, bein bifnim, yisaref bifnim. Okay, so the lower level tuma, we're going to always bring it inside, even if it got impure outside. Rabbi Akiva omer makom tumato sham sreifato. Rabbi Akiva says, wherever, okay, he goes by, okay, so let's say if we say Rabbi Eliezer goes by level of impurity only, Rabbi Akiva goes by where it is, status quo. It's there, we keep it there. It's not there, we keep it out, okay? So if it's inside, it stays inside. If it was outside, it stays outside. So comes the Gemara and says, Bar Kapara Amar, so going down to the second chart on the sheet, Bar Kapara says, Avatuma Dvar Torah, Vladatuma Midivrehem. Avatuma means it's impurity that was passed down by Torah law. And Vladatuma is something that the rabbis instituted. Okay, there's all sorts of rabbinic tumas. We're not going to get into this, but it's only an impurity on the rabbinic level. And that's why all the people who say we're going to be more lenient about it is because it's only rabbinic in nature. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Bein Zeh Bein Zeh Dvar Torah. They're both from the Torah. It's just that one is, and this is how I described it originally, there's Rishon L'Tuma and there's Sheni L'Tuma. In other words, there's something that was, if an Avatuma passed on impurity to an item, it's going to be called a Rishon. If it was only a secondary source, like a Rishon L'Tuma, then we're going to call that a Sheni L'Tuma. That's already a lower level. They're both by Torah law. It's a Rishon and a Sheni by Torah law, but it's the lower level of impurity. So Rabbi Yochanan thinks these are all Torah laws, and Bar Kapara thinks, no, we're talking about rabbinic versus Torah level. To which the Gemara is going to ask a question. Bikasha to Rabbi Yochanan al Beit Shammai. Rabbi Yochanan is not going to make sense according to Beit Shammai. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan's understanding how he reads Beit Shammai. Why? To Beit Shammai omrim hakol yisaref bifnim chutz mishenitma ba'avatuma b'chutz. Remember, he says everything gets burnt inside, other than what's an avatuma outside. Ma bein avatuma b'chutz, ma bein vladatuma b'chutz. Zeh v'zeh lo dvar Torah. So now he says, but if you're saying everything is Torah law, why should we distinguish? Now, one could answer, we distinguish because one's higher level and one's lower level. But the assumption is, they ask, it doesn't make sense that you're not distinguishing, that you're making this distinction between Torah law and Torah law. If they're both impurities by Torah law, neither should be allowed to come into the temple, right? So therefore, or really it's Beit Shammai who says everything is inside other than an avatuma that was outside. We don't want to bring that in. But if it's Torah law, and the ones that are Torah law that are the Vlada Tuma, that we're allowed to bring it in, even though it was outside. So if it's all Torah law, why do we make that distinction? And then they ask even further, according to Rabbi Yochanan. They say, but wait, why wouldn't you also ask the same question on Beit Hillel? De Beit Hillel amar hakol yisaref b'chutz. Remember, Beit Hillel said everything outside. It's the exact same question. It's just the question's reversed. Chutz mishenit ma bevlada tuma b'fnim. In other words, the opinions are reversed. But again, each one is saying that there's one extreme case, which is different than all the others because of the levels of impurity. Now, if it's all by Torah law, then all should be the same law. To which they say, they actually don't say anything. Okay, so they say, right? So again, let's just keep reading the question. Right? Other than that, ma ben vlada tuma b'fnim, ma ben ava tuma b'fnim, ze v'ze dvar Torah. Okay, they're both dvar Torah, which means, why do you make this distinction? And as I wrote here on the sheet, no answer is brought. This, as you're getting used to already from the Yerushalmi, many times they ask questions and no answer is brought. Lo havu now here, what's interesting is the Gemara is going to kind of comment about the fact that nobody comments. And it says, Lo havu bar Rabbanan ela al debar kapara. The rabbis really weren't interested in Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. For some reason, they were really only interested in bar kapara. And therefore, they move on to bar kapara, but they ask the exact same question according to bar kapara. They say, Vikasha de bar kapara al de Beit Shammai. They're going to ask now from bar kapara on Beit Shammai. Again, bar kapara and Rabbi Yochanan are Emoraim, who were discussing the Mishnah. So they say, so again, here comes the question. Again, Beit Shammai is still going to say the same thing, whether you're a bar kapara or whether you're Rabbi Yochanan. It's just a matter of how do we define avatuma, how do we define vladatuma? But again, they're going to ask the same question, which is, de Beit Shammai omrim hakol yisaref b'fnim, chutz mishenitma ba'avatuma b'chutz. Everything gets burnt on the inside, other than what gets impure from an avatuma, high level tuma, outside, which again, according to bar kapara, right, you can look back to the chart. Bar kapara says, vladatuma is rabbinic and avatuma is from the Torah. So now, ma ben avatuma, ben bachutz, ben bifnim, v'zeh lo dvar Torahi. Who? And now they say again, remember, Beit Shammai said, only an avatuma that was outside stays outside, but if it was inside, stays inside. Now, if avatuma is Torah, by Torah law, whether it's inside or outside, why would you make that distinction between being inside and outside? So now they say, well, the truth is that he's going to hold, Beit Shammai holds somewhat like Rabbi Akiva, which is, begin de Rabbi Akiva amar, makom tumato, shamte sreifato. Remember, Rabbi Akiva said it all goes by status quo. Wherever it is, that's where it stays. So Rabbi Akiva says, wherever it is, that's where you burn it. Afilu al debate Hillel o makasha. Now wait, even according to Beit Hillel, it will be somewhat difficult. Why? Because debate Hillel amar hakol yisaref b'chutz, chutz mishenit ma v'vladatuma b'fnim, ma ben vladatuma ben b'fnim ben b'chutz, ze v'ze lo midivreim hu. So in other words, again, we're going to have the same question. Why is Beit Hillel distinguishing? So if we're going to go by, we're basically going to say that they distinguish between, they go with Rabbi Akiva, that it goes by location. However, there's one extra factor here, which is, begin de Rabbi Shimon amar, ma'achalo u'mashko shel mitzorah, mishtachin chutz l'shalosh machanot. Well, they add one other thing. They kind of agree with Rabbi Akiva that really it goes by location. So now let's go back up to the chart and let's see. So if it's outside, it stays outside. If it's inside, it stays inside. But there's a few exceptions to the rule based on Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, right, to each of them. So now we're going to say, well, they hold like Rabbi Shimon, which says that when a Metzorah, if you remember, a Metzorah has to leave the camp and he has to be outside of all three camps. Likewise, his food has to be taken out. So then, since this is food, and we're talking, according to Bar Kapara, on a Deoraita level, when you're talking about Deoraita level Truma, that has to be taken outside. So that's why they're going to distinguish between the Ava Truma we're going to take outside, and Beit Hillel is going to take that across the board, right? That the Ava Truma that was inside has to be taken outside, and that's because he treats it like the food of a Metzora. If a Metzora, a leper, has food, he can't be out in the sanctified areas, and neither can the food of the leper. So likewise here, this is food. We're going to have to get the food outside, and we're not going to allow it in. Okay, moving on. This is a little bit of a difficult sugya, this section, right? All about impurities, purity, impurity. It's not always so simple. And again, it's getting to a theme that we've seen a lot about things that are allowed inside and things that aren't allowed inside. And we talked a lot in the Masechet about things that can be seen and things that can't be seen. And there's always this interplay in the temple. And it's a very interesting interplay between, there's this idea, and it was actually in this week's parsha about Nadav and Avihu and what was going on with Nadav and Avihu. In fact, came up just coincidentally, my husband spoke in shul about it this week, that the idea of Nadav and Avihu, he actually quoted Yoni Grossman, who talks about this idea that what were they trying to do? They were trying to create a fire. It was right after it says, Vayireh Kvod Hashem. The Kvod Hashem appears, and then all of a sudden they wanted to make this fire. And why did they want to make a fire? Kind of like a smoke screen. They didn't want people seeing. They thought it wasn't appropriate that people see. And that's what God was upset about, because you really can see. And there's this idea, this interplay between always what can be seen, what can't be seen, what should be in, what should be out, where are things supposed to happen, and who can see what's happening. So it's, again, a little bit of this back and forth about these debates about where things are supposed to be. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to talk about the ramp of the altar. Okay, so when you go to up the altar, there was this big ramp that led to the altar. And now I'll move down okay, now we're going to read the next Mishnah, which, okay, this is all in English, but the charts go Hebrew to English. It's just the way I'm used to doing them. So I did them Hebrew to English in terms of the direction of them. So now we're going to talk about limbs of the Tamid sacrifice, limbs of the Musaf sacrifices, which are extra sacrifices that we do on the holidays, and the limbs of the Rosh Chodesh sacrifices. So a little bit of background. They slaughter the animal. These parts all have to get burnt on the altar, and then they bring them up the altar. But one Kohen brings them, other Kohanim bring them up. We're going to get into a lot of this stuff in Yom. It's a good lead into the next Masechet. And it says here, and it's good, this is Rosh Chodesh tonight. We're starting Rosh Chodesh, at least for those who it's already nighttime. And it's nice because we're going to really talk about Rosh Chodesh now. Okay, this is again one of those very complicated versions of the text. You might have, it says bimizrach in English on the east, and bima'arav in the west, not in parentheses. So there's obviously a bit of a debate, and in the next case, it's going to be the opposite, where again, parentheses means you should take it out, but again, clearly there was a bit of a debate about which goes on which side. So the korban tamid, which is the everyday sacrifice, where would they put the parts of the body of the animal? They would put them chatzi kevesh ulamata b'ma'arav, on the bottom half of the ramp on the west. Where's the west? So remember, you go into the temple on the east. So the west is closer to the sanctified area where the sanctuary is and the Kodesh Kodashim. Shel musafim, when it's extra holiday sacrifices, nitanim mechatzi kevesh ulamata b'mizrach, on the eastern side. Shel Roshei Chodashim, when it comes to the Rosh Chodesh, nitanim al karkov hamizbeach milamalan. Also, some people say milamata. It's a debate, as we had already, where the karkov is the karkov, the part that goes around the ramp at about 6 amot of height, about 2/3 of the way up. Is it that area where the Kohanim sometimes walked around? Or sometimes people even say it was just for decoration. In fact, some people say it jutted out there so that if the Kohen fell, he would fall off from the top and fall onto that area. It's kind of a safety thing. So some people say they would put it on that area. Some people say milamalan means all the way at the top of the altar, in this place called the Karkov, which was the area that went around the Maracha, or between the Kranot HaMizbeach, which we're going to see, between the corners of the altar. That's the first part of our Mishnah. The second part has to do, and it's great that the Mishnah, that the Masechet ends. Sometimes you're expecting the Masechet almost to end with something. And this is a Masechet. In fact, one of the reasons why there's no Bavli about it is because it wasn't relevant in their times anymore. And what does the last Mishnah do? It comes and it says, what does this have to do with us today? Okay, it doesn't exactly say it the same way you or I might have asked it, but that's what they asked. HaShekalim v'habikurim einam noagim ela b'fnei habayit. They're no longer relevant nowadays. They only happen during the time the temple is around. Aval, but now they're going to compare and say there's other things that even once the temple is destroyed, we still keep. Maaser dagan, maaser behema, ubechorot nohagim bein b'fnei habayit bein shelo b'fnei habayit. So taking the trumot and masrot, the tithes of the produce, that continues even nowadays. In fact, we do that nowadays. Maaser behema, the 10th of your animals, also now, this is an interesting one. Both the 10th of your animals and the bechor, the firstborn, are supposed to be brought as sacrifices. So these are a little different because theoretically you would think that they shouldn't be relevant after the time of the temple. But the fact is they are nohagim bein b'fnei habayit ubein shelo b'fnei habayit. Now, it is very interesting about this because even though they theoretically hold, the rabbis at a certain point instituted that we're not going to keep maaser behema anymore. Okay, and that's because they were worried that people, what happens? You're supposed to leave it. You're supposed to sacrifice it. Now, we can't sacrifice nowadays. So you leave it till it gets a blemish, and then you're allowed to eat it, but without sacrificing. But they were worried that people wouldn't really do that and might end up using the animal. You're not allowed to work the animal. You're not allowed to shear the animal. So they actually stopped maaser behema at a certain point. And before they couldn't stop because maaser behema is you claim the 10th animal is going to be sanctified. So you can just not make it sanctified and you're okay. It's not like produce. We talked about this during the Masechet, that produce you can't eat until you tithe the produce. The animals, there is no such thing. So you can actually just kind of ignore it. And the rabbis basically said, we're not keeping this anymore. Bechor, they also wanted to override. The problem is the Bechor, as soon as it's born, it's already sanctified. So the rabbis came up with a solution, which is have your property owned jointly with a non-Jew. And then once you do that, it's no longer obligated in Bechor because anything jointly owned by a Jew and a non-Jew isn't obligated in Bechor. And with that, they advise people to do that if you have animals to avoid this issue of Bechor. So even though there are no hagim bein b'fnei habayit bein shelo b'fnei habayit, the rabbis kind of tried to limit the cases that this would be. Hamakdish shkalim ubikurim harei ze kodesh. Now, so we basically said shkalim and bikurim aren't relevant anymore. However, what if I say, I'm sanctifying this to the temple? Let's say I wake up in the morning and I say, I'm sanctifying, or you use one of the languages in the Torah of sanctification. So does it work? So according to Tanakama, harei ze kodesh, it works. If I take my first fruits and I say, these are bikurim, they have sanctity to it. Now, bikurim, it's very obvious why they're not, hey, when there's no bayit, because it says in the Torah, Reshit bikurei admatcha, the first of your fruits, tavi beit Hashem Elokecha, bring to the house of God. So when there's no house of God, obviously you don't do it. And the machatzit shekel is also pretty obvious, even though it doesn't really say, right? Because the machatzit shekel was also to count the people. So it's less obvious, and that's why we're going to see that maybe there's a bit of a distinction between them. So here, we're going to see the distinction in a second. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ha'omer bikurim kodesh, einan kodesh. Rabbi Shimon says there's a machloket between Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon. Tanakama says if you say shkalim and bikurim or kodesh, it's sanctified. Rabbi Shimon says bikurim or kodesh. If you say bikurim or kodesh, it doesn't work. Now notice what's missing. He doesn't talk about the shkalim. Sounds like he thinks that shkalim would be kodesh also. So the first thing we're going to ask is, what is this karkova mizbeach? So now the Gemara starts off and says, Ezu karkova mizbeach, amma ben keren, the keren makom hiluch reglei hakohanim. It's the amma between the corners of the altar, and it's in order for the kohanim to walk around. It seems to be not exactly in between, because it doesn't make sense. They'd be walking in between the corners. They'd pump into the corners all the time. It must be further in to the center of the altar, and then it's an amma around. 1 cubit around. Okay, next question. Musfei Shabbat, Musfei Rosh Chodesh Mikodem. This is a very famous question. You have Musaf of Rosh Chodesh and the Musafim of Shabbat, which goes first. Rabbi Yirmiyah Savar Meimar, Musfei Shabbat Musfei Rosh Chodesh, Musfei Rosh Chodesh Kodmim. Rosh Chodesh will go first. Now this is very strange because there's a Mishnah that we all probably, or many of us might be familiar with, which we learned a number of times already, which is tadir v'she'eno tadir, tadir kodem. The more common goes first. And Shabbat is obviously more common than Rosh Chodesh, which only comes up once a month. So this is very strange that Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to say this. Didn't he know the explicit Mishnah? And we don't really have an answer to that question. But Chayle de Rabbi Yirmiyah min Hadli, he tried to prove it from here. Shiro shel Shabbat v'shiro shel Rosh Chodesh. There was a song that they sang, the Levites would sing songs. Shiro shel Rosh Chodesh kodem, if you have a day where Shabbat is on Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbat. So you sing the song of Rosh Chodesh first. So he says, therefore also you must do the sacrifices first. Amar Rabbi Yosef, no, that's not a good proof, he says to him. Shnei yitaman, that's there, but that's for a different reason. The Amar Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, kedei lefarsemo ulehodia shu Rosh Chodesh. It's in order to publicize that it's Rosh Chodesh. And they wanted to publicize Rosh Chodesh. They wanted everyone to know when it was Rosh Chodesh. So because of that, they sung the song of Rosh Chodesh first to make it very clear. It's nice learning this on Rosh Chodesh, right? Here we have a good opportunity to make it very public. We have a lot of people here to make it very public that it's Rosh Chodesh today. Ketzad hayahu said. So on the one hand, Rabbi Yossi is saying, it's true you do the song first, but what about the sacrifice? It sounds like you do the sacrifice. Now, don't the sacrifices correspond with the song? So now he's going to say, not really. So how would you do it? Shochet musfei Shabbat v'omer lehen shiro shel Rosh Chodesh. First, you do the sacrifice of Shabbat. While you're doing the sacrifice of Shabbat, you say the song of Rosh Chodesh. And that way, this is like a classic act of balancing. We, on the one hand, want to do what's more common first. On the other hand, we want everyone to know it's Rosh Chodesh. So we're going to do a combination. We're going to slaughter the animal because that's more important. We're going to do Shabbat first there. But when it comes to the song, we're going to sing Rosh Chodesh first. And then what are we going to, right? Then Biram Hacha, and then obviously we're going to do the Rosh Chodesh and sing the song of Shabbat, which shows, by the way, the song doesn't have to match the sacrifice. Biram Hacha, Musfei Shabbat, Musfei Rosh Chodesh, Musfei Shabbat Kodmim. Hashem kol tadir mechavero kodem et chavero, and then he says basically what I said before, which is, well, the obvious reason why it has to be that the sacrifice goes first is because we always do what's more common first. Okay, now we're going to get to the Shekalim and Bikurim, and this is going to be our last sugya for today and for our Masechet. HaShekalim kadshu. So now this is what I told you. It said in the Mishnah that if you do Bikurim, it's not sanctified according to Rabbi Shimon, but it sounds like if you say today, nowadays, I'm bringing Shekalim to the temple, it would be sanctified. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Mishum Rabbi Shimon though, but somebody else passes down, Ben Elu lo kidshu. No, it's true he said it about Bikurim, but it's true also for the Shekalim, they're not sanctified. Tani. So now they bring a braita, a different topic, but similar. This is a very interesting halacha. When you convert, you're supposed to, if someone converts to Judaism, they're supposed to bring a sacrifice. You're supposed to bring a pair of birds for an ola, a burnt offering. Nowadays, you can't do that. There's no temple. So what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to bring the value of 2 bird offering, which is rivi'it kesef. It's a quarter of a dinar, of silver dinar. So you're supposed to bring that. So a ger bizman hazeh has to set aside money. Okay, we in fact don't do this. If you happen to be someone who converted, you'll be wondering, what are we talking about? Don't worry, we don't do this. Amar Rabbi Shimon, bitla Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai mipnei takala. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said, we don't want anyone doing this. What's the problem? And here comes in the classic, here we go. We don't want problems. What kind of problems are we worried about? Well, if I set aside money that's sanctified because I converted, and now I'm putting this money aside basically and sanctifying it, and it will go when the temple is rebuilt to my sacrifice, what's going to happen? What if someone uses that money and it's sanctified money? We already know what happens there. You're not allowed to do that. So we're worried about that happening. And that's what the Gemara says. Ma'u mipnei takala. And here again, we're going to have some girsa problems, textual problems. I'll fix them as we go along. Here's a braita that says we no longer can do any sort of sanctifications anymore. I'm skipping the next few words because it's not true and they take it out of the text. Bizman hazeh. Nowadays, we don't do this anymore. What do you do with it? Haksut tisaref. If it's clothing, you have to burn it because you don't want, right, anyone to do anything wrong with it. Habehema te'aker. Ketzad. Okay, so the behema has to be uprooted. What on earth does that mean? Te'aker. So we're going to read it right now. I'll just scroll down on the sheet so you can see the English. Ketzad no'el b'faneha hadelet v'hi meta me'aleha. You lock the door and you leave the animal to die. It's actually a very cruel thing to do. Unfortunately, when there's nothing else you could do and there's an animal that's sanctified, we have nothing to do with it. This is the only thing you can do. If you have money, you have to put it in the Dead Sea because there's nothing else you could do with it. Consecrated money that you have nothing to do with. Avar v'hi kiddush. So now they want to know, what if you did it anyway? Let's say the convert comes and decides to go against this takana and decides, I want to put aside money for my sacrifice. It's so important to me. What happens? Min mada amal Rabbi Shimon bitla Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai mipnei takala. Well, we can learn it from the fact that he said that we got rid of this because of the takana. What does that seem to imply? Hada amra avar v'hikdish kadsho. It must be that Rabbi Shimon thinks that it would work. Because if he didn't, or Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai thought it would work. If he didn't think it would work, then it would make a difference. We could let the convert put aside the money. If he's worried about a takala, it must mean it's actually sanctified. Rabbi Yehuda Antundaria. So now we're going to get to the last part of our daf. We're now going to bring a contradiction. According to this, what does Rabbi Shimon say? Shekalim are sanctified. Okay, right? So now we're going to see. Bai kome Rabbi Yossi. He asked Rabbi Yossi. Hada'at amal kidshu, v'hacha'at amar lo kidshu. And for this, I brought you the chart. In this Braita, we said, Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai canceled it because of the takala. That means if you did it anyway, it's sanctified. The Braita about the Shekalim, if you remember, said that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Shimon, bein elu lo kidshu. Shekalim are not sanctified. So this seems to contradict. It sounds like one views them as sanctified and one views them not as sanctified. So now we're going to say Amar le Taman, and now we skip the next 4 lines according to most versions. Okay, so we're actually going to finish quicker than you thought. Taman, it says there, Shema Yiban. Why are the Shekalim not sanctified? Because there's not just an issue that we're worried you might misuse the consecrated items. There's another issue, which is Shema Yibaneh habayit kibarishona. When was the bayit built originally, or the Mishkan really, was built on the 1st of Nisan. Now, if the temple's built on the 1st of Nisan and I sanctify some shekalim, what will happen to them? Can I use them? I won't be able to use them when the temple's rebuilt because the temple's going to be rebuilt on the 1st of Nisan. And then what will happen? That year, we can't use, remember what we learned from the beginning, you can't use shekalim from the previous year. So therefore, and therefore, when it comes to shekalim, there's going to be no way to use those shekalim in the temple, at least not. Now, there's a bit of a problem with this because you can still use them for other things, but they can't be used for their main purpose, which is to buy sacrifices for that year. This is if the temple's built on the 1st of Nisan. Let's assume it is. But when it comes to the convert, that's not an issue. The convert can always bring it. And that's why when the convert does it, it's sanctified. When you do it for the shekalim, it's not sanctified. Rav Hamnuna for Rav Ada bar Ava b'Shem Bav halacha keRabbi Shimon. But now they say that we paskin like Rabbi Shimon, and it's a bit of a question of what we paskin like Rabbi Shimon. But it sounds like for the bikurim that the bikurim are sanctified, that wouldn't be sanctified, but shekalim would be sanctified. Just going to point out one very interesting thing about this, which is the Ran and Avodah Zarah points out that if you, let's say I say I'm sanctifying something for my shul. Okay, this is something that would happen, right? I'm giving money to my shul. But let's say instead of saying that, you say the words, which in Hebrew you might say an makdish, right? Which sounds like hekdesh. The question is, does that become hekdesh? And then do you have a problem with actually using that money? So the Ran actually says that if you're, and this is fascinating because it's not only about your words, and this goes back to what we talked about sacrifices in general, about your intent. If your intent was that it go to your shul and not to the temple, then even though you said the words, I'm makdish, you're not actually being makdish. And it's really going just for your shul, which is not sanctified. Even though you might think of your shul as a sanctified place, it's not the same thing, and it's okay. With that, we're going to end our chapter because the next words are in parentheses. Hadran alach perek kol harukin uslik ala Masechet Shekalim. And with this, we finish Masechet Shekalim. I just want to point out, say 2 words about this, and then we'll move on to our, because this is a long daf. We have a program still ahead of us. So I want to just talk about how it's very interesting how the Masechet ends with relevance. And I think that a lot of what we've learned in this Masechet is very relevant. I was talking to my son today, who's an officer in the Army, and he said that it's been hard. They're all new officers on the job, and they're just not organized enough about things. And when you're an officer and in charge of things, you have to be organized, right? He said, next time I'll know better. I'll know how to get organized from the beginning. And the whole job is to get right. That when you're organizing a lot of people and you have a system, it has to be as organized as possible. And this Masechet was all about that, all about being organized and setting things up and organizing. And that's really what this Masechet was about. It was number one, being organized. It was number two. I was thinking, really, it was connected to all the things that I was really thinking about my son in the Army. He's constantly faced with decisions. You have to make decisions about things. What do we do with this? What do we do with that? Right? And things don't always fall exactly into the box exactly as you expect. So what does that remind me of? The shofarot, right? You have money in the middle. What do you do with it? You don't know where it goes, right? You're constantly dealing with all sorts of questions and things that you don't have an easy answer about. So they're trying to give you a recipe for what are the easy answers. If it's here, that's how you do it. If it's here, that's how you do it. And and to giving charity, how to give charity properly, right? These are all things that create a society that runs in an organized fashion. So that's really what my takeaway from Shekalim is again, I kept pointing out throughout the learning about the interpersonal relationships and how we have to get along with each other and how we create things. Anyway, this is some thoughts for today. We're going to stop now and we're going to do the Hadrans. Okay, I'm going to pull them up on the screen and we can do them together. The way we're going to do it today is a little bit different than usual. We're going to read the Hadran alachs 3 times, the first paragraph. Then we're going to move to Shari, and Shari's going to read her special Hadrans for her Siyum, because she's doing a Siyum HaShas after 7.5 years of finishing learning. She'll say the Hadran 3 times with her own special text. It's going to include Masechet Shekalim and Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. And then we're going to, and Talmud Bavli. Sorry, not Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. We call it Shas, but it's Talmud Bavli. And then we're going to continue with the second part of the ritual part. Okay, here goes. Everybody ready? Hadran alach Masechet Shekalim v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Shekalim v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Shekalim v'lo titnashe minan. Lo ba'al mahaden v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Shekalim v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Shekalim v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Shekalim v'lo titnashe minan. Lo ba'al mahaden v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Shekalim v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Shekalim v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Shekalim v'lo titnashe minan. Ba'al mahaden v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Okay, Shari.
Hadran alach Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'Hadran alan. Da'aten alech Masechet Shekalim u'Talmud Bavli v'Da'atech alan. La nitnashe minach Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'lo titnashi minan. La ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'Hadran alan. Da'atech ela alech Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'da'atech alan. La nitnashe minach Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'lo titnashi minan. La ba'alma haden v'la ba'alma di'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'Hadran alan. Da'atech alech Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'da'atech alan. La nitnashe minach Masechet Shekalim v'Talmud Bavli v'lo titnashi minan. La ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma de'ate.
Okay, we'll continue together. Yehi ratzon l'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei Avotenu shetehei toratcha umanutenu ba'olam hazeh utehei imanu la'olam haba. Hanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surchar bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha befiנו ופיפיות עמך בית ישראל ונהיה אנחנו, כולנו, צאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. מאוהבי תחכמני מצוותיך, כי לעולם היא לי. יהי ליבי תמים בחוקיך, למען לא אבוש. לעולם לא אשכח פיקודיך, כי בם חייתני, ברוך אתה אדוני למדני חוקיך, אמן, 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 סלע ועד. יהי רצון בפניך אדוני אלוהי, כשם שעזרתני לסיים מסכת שקלים, כן תעזרני להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמדו לנו ולזרענו, שלא תמוש התורה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. ויתקיים בנו, בתהלכך תנחה אותך, בשוכבך תשמור עליך, בהקיצות היא תשיחך. כי בי ירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בימינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. Shkach to everyone. Mazal tov to Shari. It's really a thrill to have Shari with us. I want to, at someone's recommendation, I wanted to, thank you Phyllis, to start the first words of Masechet Yoma to get you started with it, as is the custom at some Siyums, many Siyums. So we're going to read the first few words of Masechet Yoma, which is Shivat Yamim Kodem Yom Kippurim Mafrishim Kohen Gadol Mibeto L'Lishkat Paredrin. 7 days before Yom Kippur, we separate the Kohen Gadol from his house and we start preparing 7 days before. So why did I think this was so relevant to Shari? Because the 7 days before, the 7 years before, right? Shari's been preparing for this moment, not just for 7 days, but for 7 years, 7.5 years. And I remember when Shari started, and I just wanted to say, you don't all know Shari personally, but Shari came to I used to teach around my dining room table, and Shari started 7.5 years ago. She'll tell you a little bit about when she started. And Shari, one thing that typifies Shari is her incredible insightfulness, and always had interesting questions, interesting things to add. And I wanted to use this as an example really to say that it's women like Shari, and not just Shari, but many other women like her, who sat around my table for the last the previous cycle of 7.5 years, and whose challenging questions and insights really changed the shape of the way I teach. So I have you all to thank for that, and particularly you, Shari, and all the other women who came day in, day out, and now the crowd has grown tremendously, and I really gain from every question and every insight and every from all people who learn, and it really enriches the group as a whole. So thank you, Shari, for sharing with us, and let's hear from you now.
First of all, thank you everybody for sharing my Siyum. I could never have imagined 7.5 years ago that we'd be sharing with hundreds of people. This is an amazing accomplishment for Michelle mostly, but it's an incredible joy for me. And thanks for the lovely intro, Michelle. This day crept up on me unwittingly. Daf Yomi has become such a daily habit that at first I didn't make a big deal about finishing the cycle. And then all of you, my friends, my family, my Daf Yomi friends, you all got so excited for me that I realized maybe this is really a big deal. So thank you. I wanted to say that the Siyum is in memory of my father, Martin Greenwald. Though he couldn't have known, I have been doing Daf Yomi thanks to him. My father, whose Yortzeit was actually on Chol HaMoed Pesach a few weeks ago, and actually also today, April 11th, was a pharmacist in Milford, Pennsylvania for many years. We lived there full time until I was 12, and we were almost the only Jews. And then he and my mother made great sacrifices that we could move our family to a more Jewish community. They chose Teaneck, New Jersey, and became very active in Jewish institutions as soon as they arrived. Jewish life and education were paramount to my parents, and it's a lesson I've carried with me since. My father retired after an illness in middle age, and it gave him more time to do the things he wanted to do. He loved nature, Shabbat, and his family more than anything. He died too young, but from him I've learned courage in ways that are impossible to describe. I would like to also dedicate this Siyum in memory of another person who was important in many of our lives, the former rabbi of Beit Knesset Ohel Ari in Ra'anana, a founder of Beit Hillel, Rav Ronen Neubert, who passed away suddenly over Pesach at the age of 50, We are all still in shock, reeling from this terrible loss. Rav Ronen was more than a Rav to us. He was also a very good friend. He officiated at the weddings of our children. He attended their army ceremonies, their tekkasim. We worked together on shul projects. He and Penina became close friends, and it is almost impossible to believe that he isn't in our world now. We wish much comfort to his family. Michelle, in addition to my dad, it is thanks to my wonderful friend Michelle, Rabbanit Michelle Farber, that I am here. In 2013, I was at the end of the year of saying Kaddish for my father. Though not many women were saying Kaddish in our shul at that time, I found the fellowship of the daily minyan and Ranana very comforting. I was concerned about how I'd feel afterwards. For a variety of reasons, Michelle suggested I join their women's Daf Yomi group, which she levered every morning in her house, as she just told you. It was amazing. We showed up every morning in her very clean house. Though I'd never formally studied Talmud, it intrigued me and I joined. And so we met day in and day out in person for years until we moved to Jerusalem in late 2019. And then Corona was kind enough to bring Michelle back to my living room care of Zoom. I jumped in at the beginning of Masechet Tractate Yoma, the 5th book in the traditional Daf Yomi cycle. Knowing not a word of Aramaic, but indebted to my translated Art Scroll edition, I was immediately captivated. The Talmud made Jewish history come alive. It filled in the blanks in a very human way. The Holy Temple was suddenly demystified. Real people with real names worked there. They negotiated their salaries. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, even had a potential substitute wife. What was I getting into? There were secret passages, hidden places. Who knew? I was sold. I was in. In the ensuing years, I dipped my feet in the water and began to swim. I did not become a Talmud scholar, but I've grown to love the study of Talmud. It is our collective Jewish heritage and is now an inseparable part of my life. I am proof that lo bashamayim hi, the Talmud is accessible to all of us, anyone. For those of you who are just beginning to study or are considering, or even those who want to just dabble now and then, the Talmud is a rich world of ideas, an entire world. Amid the details, step aside and hear the fabric of the words, the larger concepts. We are eavesdropping on the discussions of generations, from the most mundane to the most profound. As a whole, it's a sweeping, magical ride. Please forgive any errors I might make. I was asked what impressions struck me most over the past 7.5 years. So here are a few, and I invite you to come along with me. To start, Masechet Yoma. It's called Yoma because it's preparation for the big day, Yom Kippur in the temple. Dealing with human behavior is a primary topic of HaShas. The Talmud is honest. The high priests, the Kohanim in the temple were mostly la creme de la creme, but a few were corrupt. A lottery system had to be established to fairly distribute roles. It isn't whitewashed, the Talmud, which I appreciated. It is very human. On the other hand, the efforts of the Kohen Gadol on behalf of his nation on Yom Kippur were incredible. So much rested on one man. So many people worked to prepare him. The evolution of Yom Kippur is far more holy and complex than I knew, and the study of Yoma changed and enriched my personal experience of Yom Kippur. Next Masechet is Masechet Sukkah. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I have to bring this one up because I happen to be an architect. And I thought that I would love the details of Masechet Sukkah because nobody loves boring details more than an architect. So many measurements, amot, who knows? And do you know how small the smallest possible sukkah can be? Wait. But it was the stories and the discussions in this Masechet that fascinated me most. Do any of you know that an elephant can be the wall of a sukkah? You will learn that. Did they even have elephants in ancient Israel or in Bavel, in Babylonia? I never researched this, but it seemed that rabbis were asking this for a deeper reason. Perhaps they were being provocative. Why were they asking this question like this? Became a favorite question of mine. There are often layers to a Gemara discussion, like peeling an onion. I could see how one can spend a year analyzing the complexities. Daf Yomi whets the appetite for more. Morality. If you don't have a lulav on Sukkot, can you steal one? They ask that. Does a positive commandment override a negative commandment? What is morality? Obviously, not to follow commandments blindly. And then there's the fun story of Rabbi Akiva's flimsy sukkah on a ship. Next, Masechet Rosh Hashanah, the advanced science and math in ancient times is fascinating. You can practically get a degree in physics and astronomy by studying this tractate. They use the heavens as GPS and the sun and moon as Google Calendar. I had no idea that these concepts were hidden in the Talmud. A version of the Pythagorean theorem was used to calculate angles. Was this Greek influence or was it discovered independently? Another great thing to research. Going along, Masechet Ta'anit, fasting. This was one of my favorites. It's full of gems. You realize how modern and yet how ancient we still are by learning about how critical rain was in the survival of all people. Rain was the life force. Societies collectively fasted if rain didn't come, sometimes for days. Today, we can desalinate and can move water from place to place easily. We are still at the mercy of nature, even now. Witness the modern devastation of hurricanes, earthquakes, and yes, Corona. Then there is the famous story of Choni HaMa'agel, Choni the circle drawer. Look it up on page 19. He even has his own Wikipedia page and a tomb you can visit in the Galil. Here is a man who bargained with God on his own terms to bring rain. And then he got rain, and then he was rewarded by being excommunicated because of his tone, how he spoke to God. Fascinating discussion ensues that sounds eerily familiar to today's times. Masechet Megillah. As you can see, the Talmud is loosely marching through the year. Rain comes, then winter, and then Purim arrives. We can read Megillah to a congregation. Who can read Megillah? If no men were available, then children, deaf mutes, and even women. Imagine a group of smart women sitting around a table learning about what we were not allowed to learn about. It was wonderful to be in a group of women for this. There's a lot more on this. Masechtot Moed Katan and Chagiga. These Masechtot are all about the intermediate days of the holidays, Chol HaMoed, and what is permitted, and then it segues suddenly into the laws of mourning. There's no separate tractate for many subjects that you'd think should be in the canon. Death and mourning, big topics, but it's all over the place and it's partly here. In case any of you are worrying about how to keep up, it can be challenging, happens to all of us. These Masechtot came in and out in the months before we had the wedding of one of our children. This was a whirlwind time for me and I had a hard time keeping up with the Daf. I missed many days. Technology to the rescue. I'm a swimmer and I bought underwater headphones and I downloaded the Daf on podcasts. Ever the multitasker, I was able to make up the Daf while doing laps between splashing. I used to laugh, thinking I may have been the only woman in the world who was doing Daf Yomi underwater at the time. Thanks to Michelle and the explosive growth of women learning Talmud, I bet that women are now doing Daf everywhere. The next 6 books are known as the Order of Women. I was looking forward to this. What did a bunch of ancient men have to say about women? In fact, it's not even clear why each of these 6 topics are included in a section about women. Nazir, zealots, nidarim, oaths. What did these topics have to do with women? The connections are actually very interesting, not at all what I expected, and it was certainly fun to be in a women's study group for this. Masechet Yevamot, this is one of the more challenging, complex tractates. How does one teach the complex concept of yibum, the Torah requirement of a brother to marry his brother's childless widow? A man dies, but does his name have to die with him? Yibum ensures continuity of a name, but it also had practical applications regarding inheritance and tribes keeping control over land. Even more interesting, perhaps to us, was the explanation of the chalitza process, in which a woman may refuse the marriage if she does a very odd ceremony with a shoe. There are many examples of the powerlessness of women depicted in the Talmud, but this is not one of them. Yibum is still practiced in modern-day Israel in some Sephardic families. We read about one case in the newspaper as we were learning about it. It's very rare, but it happens. And if you like IQ-like logic problems, this is the book for you. Keeping track of the complex family relationships was very challenging. I don't know if Michelle remembers, but she used her children's dolls as learning tools. Anyone coming into our class at that time might have wondered what we were doing. Masechet Ketubot, Gitin, and Kedushin. They all deal with marriage, the rights or lack of rights of women. Age of consent, shocking, but it was a different time. Sex, divorce, drama, lots of drama. My takeaway from these sections was how far we have come as modern women. We are not there yet, witness the problem of agunot, but we are light years away from the lives of women a few thousand years ago. Masechet Nedarim and Nazir, zealots and oaths. The power of the word in Judaism is fascinating. The taking of oaths and extremism were strongly discouraged by the sages. This illustrated the power of the spoken word in Judaism more than anything. You say something, you better think about it first. Be prepared to stick to your word, because breaking vows was considered a very serious offense. The Torah allows one to take on the yoke of extremism, to be a Nazir, to forsake haircuts, great products, and to avoid contamination with the dead. One would think that religious leaders would love this, encourage a higher religious level, like monk could. But I was struck by how the opposite seems to be true. Like oaths, extremism is strongly discouraged. The rabbis seem to be saying that this was allowed, but excessive. One could reach high spiritual heights through regular practices and equality. I love what that says about Judaism. Another great lesson for modern times as we grow increasingly polarized. Damages, the babas, Baba Metzia, Baba Batra. This is the next section. These sections are known collectively as nizikim, damages. Some of the most well-known tractates of the Talmud are in this section, dealing with civil laws, torts, theft, punishment, boundaries, responsibility, witnesses, testimony, judicial processes, how humans must live together in a civil society. So many of these laws no longer seem revolutionary to us, but they must have been very revolutionary at the time. Sanhedrin was one of my favorite tractates, full of topics that I delved into more deeply on weekends, such as the formation of a Jewish legal system, the characteristics of a true leader, and finally, capital punishment. These sections are not dry legal tomes, don't worry. They challenge us morally to think throughout about the victim as much as the perpetrator. They are also peppered with agadata, Talmudic moralistic stories, as well as legends about famous biblical personalities. They're really amazing. Kedoshim, this next section, several tractates, is all about the sacrifices in the temple. Truthfully, who would not find this daunting at the outset? Who is not saying secretly to themselves, if ever there was a time to quit Daf Yomi, maybe this is it? Do I really need to learn this? What possible relevance could this have to my life? Very nice that we ended the Masechet with this and that Michelle actually touched on this at the last page. And yet, like all of the Talmud until now, I didn't know what awaited me. And wow, was I surprised. It is never what you think it will be. First, the sages were doing something very noble. They were trying to preserve and record what they conceived were the practices of the temple before they could be forgotten. The second temple had been destroyed about 200 years before the earliest Talmudic voice is heard. The sages relied on testimony and expanded on what they knew of sacrificial practices. Learning this section, one can feel the importance of their mission. It's nice to be part of it. In addition, the details of the sacrifices were actually interesting. The process was demystified, made real. Who did what and when? More interesting were why and with what intent, also touched on tonight. Intent plays a big role in sacrifices. In a practice that seems on the surface to be so action-oriented, thought is critical. If the Kohen charged with sacrificing your animal is distracted and didn't have the proper intent, your sacrifice might not count. After the destruction of the temple, sacrifices were replaced by personal prayer, and a person no longer had to outsource his God connection to a third party, the Kohen. For a time, though, this was Judaism. This is how it was practiced, and it's important and interesting to know how it worked. On a side note, these tractates are not for the faint-hearted. Plenty of blood and gore. Chulin is a veritable butcher's manual, and by the end, a few of us were sworn vegetarians. We were also amateur veterinarians, knowing the anatomical system of all kosher animals, as well as the various wingspans of grasshoppers. There was a certain amount of pride when we finished these challenging tractates. Kudos to Michelle for extraordinary teaching. Nita wrapped up the traditional cycle, we, a group of women, learning about men's views of menstruation. A complex tractate, though. Many of you have been here for the start of the new Daf Yomi cycle since January 2020. Brachot, kol hakavod to you. Brachot, Shabbat, Eruvin, Pesachim, and Shekalim. And it's delightful to see the blossoming of our small Daf Yomi group into something large and worldwide. Tips for those looking to last the long haul. The Daf Yomi system is brilliant because each day starts anew. It is a taste that allows you to dig deeper in your own time, if you wish, or quite honestly, pass quickly if a certain page doesn't pique your interest. It is worth sticking with the Daf cycle even if a certain tractate title seems uninteresting or too complex. I found the Talmud to be the ultimate example of ADD editing. A paragraph that could confuse a builder or a butcher, let alone an amateur like me, suddenly segues into the most fascinating story about Queen Shlomtzion HaMalka or a charging ethical debate. See this as a 7.5-year course, which will pass very quickly, I can tell you, in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The sweeping breadth of knowledge that you will gain is invaluable. I am looking forward to starting again. You are also part of a huge community. I was once sitting on an airplane when I realized that my seatmate, as unlike me as one could be, had his Talmud open to the same page as me. Fellow Daf Yomi studiers, we proceeded to discuss the Daf as if we were old friends. Life has happened in these 7.5 years, good, healthy life for which I'm enormously grateful. The Daf has been my constant friend each day, accompanying me through thick and thin. I wake up to the sun, to a new day, a new Daf, always moving forward. And in ending Kaddish, I embarked on a new beginning. Continuing Jewish learning has allowed me to keep the souls of both of my parents alive in me. It is indeed a celebration. Thank you.
Wow. Amazing. I think that was a huge inspiration to all of us, Shari. Thank you for sharing your journey with us. And we're very appreciative that you chose to celebrate together with all of us. We're now thrilled to welcome Rabbanit Yael Leibowitz to our Siyum. She has a master's in Judaic Studies from Columbia University, has been teaching Tanakh to high school and college students, while also leading continuing educational courses at Matan. Through her unique and analytical approach to the text, while appreciating its historical context, she brings the characters and stories to life. We're privileged to learn more with her together in her talk about the Aron, entitled Inheritors of the Lost Ark. Yael.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. First of all, Mazal Tov to everyone tonight celebrating. And Shari, that was absolutely beautiful, stunning, really. And I'm not really sure what I can possibly add to that. I was told to make the Talmud more sort of relatable, but I'm pretty sure you did that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share screen right now just for a couple of minutes, and I'm just gonna give you a heads up because I know we're running a little bit late. I will probably in all likelihood not go through all of these sources inside, but I'm gonna sort of touch on them and I'll refer to them as I mention them, so feel free for your own edification just to keep them up. Are the words okay, Michelle? Can you see them or it's too small? You got it? Okay. So the Masechet that you're all making a Siyum on tonight really deals most prominently with the donations from the temple. But as I think Shari mentioned and Michelle mentioned as well, it addresses lots of other topics sort of in passing, as you know, the ADD reference over there made reference to. And one of the topics really, it covers really a wide range of temple related issues. One of the topics that I wanted to focus on tonight in particular that's mentioned on Daf Tet Vav, which you have right there in your first sources, is one of the stories that I imagine many of you are familiar with regarding the whereabouts of the Aron, of the Ark. And we know that the Aron was used in the Mishkan and in the first temple, but we also know, and the Gemara mentions this actually in a couple of places, that it was not used in the second temple. And so there's some speculation as to what happened to the Aron. And according to the Gemara that you've all learned, the Aron was actually hidden away. Some believe that it was hidden away in the days of Yoshiyahu. And the Gemara there actually mentions the legend about the Kohen that notices that one of the floor tiles was slightly raised. And he understood somehow that the Aron must have been hidden underneath, but of course he was killed before he could reveal what he knew. As if to say, I would imagine, but of course, again, I imagine many of you probably discussed this during your learning together, what that story is really implying. But I think on the most surface level, the Gemara or the Mishnah in that case seems to be telling us that the hiding place of the Aron is actually meant to be hidden. And so it goes without saying that, as with everything Jewish, right, there's lots of other theories as well as to where the Aron disappeared to. You have on your sources right over there, source 2, the pasuk that many people quote from the end of Divrei Hayamim, that talks about the fact, or sort of deduce from that pasuk that refers to the different kelim that were removed in the days of the Babylonians, that perhaps the Aron was taken out along with some of the other holy vessels. Actually, in the second book of Maccabees, you have that there also in your sources, source 3, which was written approximately 100 BC, but that's not really a great date, says that actually Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah the prophet, knowing that the temple was going to be destroyed, hid the ark along with other things in a cave on Har Nevo. And the second book of Maccabees talks about really describes the scene. It's a fantastic scene. You should read it inside. And the scene that's described there has Yirmiyahu telling his followers that the place should remain hidden until the appointed time. Right. So, of course, the second book of Maccabees was fodder for Indiana Jones. Right. And there's no shortage of traditions. And there are people that believe that it ended up in Ethiopia. Some argue that there's a community in Yemen that argues that they know exactly where the Aron is. There are theories that it ended up down in Egypt. I guess, again, only Harrison Ford really can the teku will have to be done by Harrison Ford. But the question that I wanted to sort of put out there, and that I really think is worth asking, is why the obsession with knowing, right, where the Aron ended up, or with locating it. And just for sort of a point of comparison, we don't really have similar legends about the fate of the Shulchan or the Mizbach HaNechoshet. I think the only perhaps comparable example might be the menorah, but I think that really the obsession with the menorah comes more likely from the Arch of Titus, from the depiction of it in the Arch of Titus, from the destruction of the Second Temple. And so what I wanted to sort of just address tonight and maybe throw out there is, what is it about the Aron that couldn't be replicated in the Second Temple, right? All the other kelim were remade again, whether they were melted down the first time, whether they were stolen. The Aron, in contrast, is this thing that was created once in history, and it then takes up so much space in our collective imagination, right? And beyond that, by the way, it's, the other thing we should sort of look at is why this preoccupation with the ark perhaps teaches us about the temple and about what it meant to Jews all those years ago. So I think that if we think about what the Aron really, it goes without saying, right? And I think this is sort of Van Meilav, but it's something we always should just mention, that any discussion of our past, and certainly as it pertains to discussions of the Mikdash, demand that we understand the broader historical and social context and really the world of which Israel was a part. And that means really that in order to understand what the Mikdash meant to ancient Israel, we need to understand what temples were and what they meant to people in the ancient world, more broadly speaking, because how human beings experience the world is something that's always changing. And so when the Torah was given to Am Yisrael, and Chazal say that it was given Kilshon B'nei Adam, right? It's given in the language of man. So it's not referring just to simply the language, right? It doesn't mean that the Torah was written in Hebrew. It's speaking really about the form that made sense to Israel, that the Tanakh, or the Torah, and the laws in the Torah were presented in a way that Israel could understand, using the standards, not just language, but symbols and associations of the world in which they live. And so, I always, I quote the Heilige Uncle Moshe. Okay, just by way of example, if we were to ever ask a child where Hashem is today, so most children that grew up, if they were lucky enough to grow up on Uncle Moshe tapes, would know Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, up, down, right, left, right? And one of the things that I speak with my students about a lot, really, because it's so important to understand, is that we are in a different place. Uncle Moshe and we, right? The collective modern Jew is in a very, very different place, theologically speaking, than Israel was in biblical times and where ancient Israel was coming from. Because in the ancient world, The truth is that there were, well, again, no Israelite would deny that God was transcendent, right? For example, but the focus when it came to ancient worship was actually God's immanence, was God's presence. And in the ancient world, temples were built because they were believed to be the abode or the dwelling place of the deity that was being worshipped. And ancient people all over the world believed that a deity, if a god, could be located in that space. So temples were about being able to locate God almost as a foundation or a prelude to worship. And you see this in a bunch of these psukim that I brought, even when Hashem talks about, when we look, for example, in source 4, right? We talk about the rebellion of the people in the desert. What they were asking in that pasuk there is, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu ayin, is God in our midst, right? Very few modern Jews would say, is God in our midst? We may talk about how to connect to God. We may theorize about why bad things happen to good people, but this obsession with God being in our midst is something that was very, very real to the ancient Israelite. And even when God is speaking about the Makot, he says, L'man te'da ki ani Hashem b'kerev ha'aretz, that they should understand through the miracles of the 10 plagues that I am there. And when Hashem commands us to build a mikdash, he says, V'yasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, I will be literally in your midst. And we now know that really from Tanakh, that Hashem's presence was something that was both attractive and alluring, meaning it was something that people wanted to be close to. But at the same time, if you got too close, it could also be fatal. Right? And I think perhaps the best example of this sort of dichotomous presentation of God's presence is seen actually by Har Sinai. And I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I'm not going to read through these psukim all inside, but please look here. You have in Sefer Shmot, you have the contrast there between the warnings before Har Sinai, before Matan Torah, when Hashem warns Moshe, and he says, V'higbaltem, put all these barriers around the Har. The people are going to want to jump and touch the Har, but be really careful. They're going to want to come and approach me and come near the mountain, but you make sure you put those boundaries around the mountain lest they come near me because my presence is fatal. But then if you jump down to the very next parak, as soon as Bnei Israel, as soon as the people heard God's voice, they were terrified and they begged Moshe to replace Hashem. They were terrified of God's presence. And so there's sort of this cross when it comes to Hashem's presence between fascination and fear, and the synthesis of those two experiences. Right? And again, this is, sort of a discussion for a different time, but it makes sense then if you think through all the times in Tanakh where Hashem manifests, so to speak, when Hashem appears to Moshe for the first time, when Yeshayahu is describing in Parak Vav his impressions of God in the Mikdash, that Hashem manifests as fire, because it's something that mesmerizes, it's something that keeps us warm, but if we get too close, we're going to be burned. And so essentially what the Mikdash provided for Israel was a safe, controlled, carefully prescribed way to approach and worship God, where all the details of worship, and this is what you guys are going through daily, right? Learning through are all of the Pikayun rituals that they were carefully outlined. And in that way, Israel understood how to correctly and effectively worship Hashem. Right? And we don't have to even mention the infamous story of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aron, that sort of stepped beyond the exact specifications of ritual and were incinerated on the spot by God's presence. And so going back to the Aron, I think that one of the most distinguishing features between Israel and the other pagan nations. I said, Dibra Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam, that Israel was, by definition, a product of its ancient Near Eastern environment. But at the same time, it also goes without saying that the Torah, the revolution, the monotheistic revolution as articulated by the Torah, also made sure that the temple was distinct, that the temple was unique in lots of different ways. And so I would say one of the most distinguishing features between Israel and the other pagan nations that surrounded it was the fact that we alone didn't have any physical representation of Hashem, right? We're an aniconic religion. So we too built a temple, V'shachanti b'tocham, so Hashem can dwell in our midst, but we didn't have any physical representation. We were, in all likelihood, the only temple in the entire ancient Near East without a statue, without an idol inside. That being said, the actual space in which Hashem is believed to sit, or perhaps we might say the throne of God, was represented by none other than the Aron. And you have a couple of these sources on your sheets, and I actually realized as I was skimming through that I forgot to put the most important pasuk, which the epithet that when we refer to God, we call Hashem, one of the epithets that we use for God in Tanakh is Hashem Yoshev HaKruvim, that Hashem sat on the Aron. Hashem sort of manifested and appeared on the Aron. The Luchot were stored inside, but Hashem appeared with the Aron. And if you look, for example, even when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beit HaMikdash, so as soon as the Aron was moved into the Kodesh Kodashim, it filled up with that anan, with that smoke. And from that moment on, it says in Parak Chet in Sefer Melachim, no one was there then allowed to enter the Mikdash because it was understood to be sort of imbued with God's presence, which again, as we learned from Matan Torah, we can't get too close to. It's also not a coincidence. The famous pasuk we say every time we open the Aron in Shul, Vayihi bin Soa ha'Aron, right? Whenever the ark traveled, so the enemies in front of us scattered. The Aron was understood almost as the footstool or the palanquin of God. And so the famous story some of you might be familiar with in Shmuel, where they went out to war and took the Aron with us out to war, and the Plishtim were terrified and fled. And then, of course, unfortunately, the Aron was captured. But again, all of those narratives there are speaking towards this conception of the Aron as literally the throne of Hashem, and the belief that Hashem is in their presence if the Aron is there. And I think all of that helps us sort of understand why the Aron, more than any of the other vestments, more than any of the other Klei Mikdash, remains such a focus over the millennia, because they really represented so much in Israelite thought. But Shari, you inspired all of us, I think, to sort of think beyond, right, just what's written on the page, and to really address, at least what I understood from your words was, that there's so much more underneath, and it's not just about learning what happened, but it's about understanding. I think what we're all searching for when we learn Torah, whether it's Tanakh, whether it's Gemara, is that what we want to understand is not just what something meant for our ancestors, but at the end of the day, consciously or unconsciously, we're searching for meaning that's relevant to us, right? In our changed world, in a world that no longer looks like the world in which the Torah was given or the temple stood. And at the end of the day, we also want to know how the concepts that we're learning are relevant to our modern lived religious experience. And I think that the Aron, or the Mikdash and the halachot surrounding it, is actually one of the most amazing examples of how historical contingencies and the genius of our ancestors sort of come into play. Because if we actually look back at our temple's history, what we notice is that the conceptions of the Mikdash and God's presence as it relates to the Mikdash were never static. And they've actually been evolving over the course of the millennia of Jewish history. And the first major shift, I don't have to tell any of you, took place it goes without saying, after the first destruction, right? And in the ancient world, and you have a great picture here that's actually from Assyria. There you go, sorry, my apologies. It's an Assyrian relief, and it's not depicting the destruction of the temple, but it's an Assyrian relief from the 8th century BCE. And so it's depicting really how in the ancient world, what destructions of temples were understood to be. They were understood to be destroying the house of the deity, which meant that that deity had been defeated. And so if you see there, they're carrying out actually the idols themselves, as if to say, your God has been defeated. And so after the first temple was destroyed, right, Israel had to sort of wrap their minds around the concept that the place that once housed their God had been completely destroyed. And so theologically, they talked about God as universal and God as bringing the destruction as a punishment for us. Right? It's not that God had been defeated. It actually proves God's strength that the temple was destroyed, because God said it was going to be destroyed. And beyond that, one of the things that we begin to see, and you have it here in your pasuk from Yirmiyahu, is an increased focus on the words of Yirmiyahu that spoke to God's strength as being indicated through the destruction. And then beyond that, also as a universal God, as a God that could hear tefillot from wherever they're uttered. Right? Now, again, the Torah always spoke of God as universal, but that way of imagining him was eclipsed for years by the image of him inside the temple. And so once the temple was destroyed, the focus of God as universal, as not needing one specific place, as I could stand in my place in Bavel and daven towards the Mikdash, and Hashem will hear me anyway, even if I'm not physically there, was something that was really, really important. It's almost as if the Beit HaMikdash began to exert in the Second Temple period this centripetal pull on the Jews that existed throughout the diasporas. And so we have, for the first time in Tanakh ever, Daniel davening towards Yerushalayim, which was almost unheard of. But it was really then, it goes without saying, and with this I'll sort of close, that after the destruction of the Second Temple and the final complete destruction of Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba rebellions, that, like you were saying, Shari, our rabbis understood that the challenge that faced them was the challenge to imagine a centerless Judaism, and a Judaism that centered towards which everything was directed is lost. And so what the rabbis ingeniously understood is what they needed to do was create a Judaism that revered the temple, but, and I don't remember Shari or if you or Michelle mentioned this, I think Michelle did, in terms of the tefillot, the 3 tefillot, that on the one hand to revere the temple and then to build on the concepts of temple in a way that could infuse a temple-less world with ways of attaining closeness to God and with the same effects that temple ritual provided. And so they created, and what you're going to be started learning, and what you'll continue learning for, till you hit that 7.5-year mark and then beyond, is that what you're really looking at in the Mishnah and the Gemara is the outlines of a portable, cohesive religion in the absence of temple, that at the same time was understood to be not necessarily novel, right? But a continuation of the temple that was. And so if we look at the halachot that are constituted by the Tanaim and the Amoraim that you're going to be learning about over the course of Daf Yomi. So we see, as I mentioned, the davening 3 times a day connected the korbanot. And what Chazal are saying is that, again, while there are no longer animal sacrifices on the altar, there's an alternative to sacrifice. There's a different way of accomplishing what the ritual of sacrifice accomplished. We know that the halachot regarding proper conduct in shul are based on the notion that a shul needs to be treated like a mikdash ma'at, like a mini temple, a place where we are reverent and aware what it means to be inside a hallowed space, right? Chazal say that if you're learning Torah and doing mitzvot, so there are behaviors that actually attract the Shekhinah. If 3 people are sitting together and learning, just like we are all now, so the divine presence, it says Shekhinah shora beinehem, that the divine presence is in our midst. And so I imagine that as you learn through Shekalim, one of the things that you realize is that the rules, really speaking about donations to the temple, were never about donations, right? The rules, and Michelle, you definitely mentioned this, certainly the Agadot interspersed, explore things like human nature, like human connection to ritual, like greed and kindness, because the Gemara is so much more than just dry rules or just memories of what was. Right? It's almost as if we might say that the ongoing search for the Aron that the Gemara intimates, right? Sort of talking about how it's hidden. And so it sort of piques our interest and we're always searching. I think it's more than just about finding that gold box. I think that on some level, if I could, maybe read into this Mishnah a tiny bit, I think on some level, Chazal there are speaking about this ongoing search, about the ongoing yearning, the striving for that closeness, for that feeling of imminence, that the placement of the Aron in the Kodesh Kodashim guaranteed. And so in many ways, while the Mishnah and the Gemara speak about the details of the Mikdash that was, what follows throughout HaShas are all the myriad of ways to reconstruct, not just physically, but spiritually speaking, that closeness, that very real sense that the God of the universe is here, that the halachot outline our lives, essentially identify those ways in which we can perform rituals and accomplish ultimately what the Aron meant for ancient Israel. They teach us how to build a life that befits God's presence, both on the personal, but perhaps more importantly, even on the communal level. So I just wanted to say, if I was not in awe of each and every one of you already every day, I certainly am now after being able to sort of just participate in this tiny little slice of what you guys are so dedicated to do. And I just wanted to wish you luck on this amazing adventure. Remind you to keep an eye out, not for just what's being said on the surface of the daf, but as Shari mentioned, for those ways in which Chazal use these ancient and antiquated halachot to infuse meaning in our lives and to infuse understanding. And then beyond everything else, really just the tools that we can draw from to connect that much more deeply to God and to our community and to the, I guess what we would call the entire holistic religious experience. So thank you really again for this opportunity to be a tiny, tiny piece of this amazing journey, and good luck and mazal tov to everyone tonight.
Thank you so much, Yael. That was beautiful. That was a great way for us to get a bit of a sum up of Shekalim, a lead into Yoma, which is going to deal a lot again with temple centered. It will be a very temple centered focus. And we're very much looking forward to starting on Tuesday. We invite you all to join with us. Just thanks again to Maggie for everything, all the background work and all the front ground work, everything you do, Maggie. Thank you. Thank you to Shoshana Baker for all her hard work and dedication. And we now have a new staff member. I just wanted, she couldn't make it tonight. She had a bat mitzvah, family bat mitzvah, but Shuli Schwartz has joined us on our staff and she'll be working on programming. So we're excited about that. If you do dedications, she'll be the one communicating with you now and taking over from Shoshana's hard work. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. Mazal tov to everybody who's finishing. Mazal tov to all those who joined us who aren't finishing. Those of you who are maybe a few days behind, it could always finish later. It's all good. And as Shari proved to us today. So thank you for all coming, and great getting to celebrate with you. Another 80 some odd days till the next Siyum. We'll open up the mics now if people want to say anything.
Mazal tov.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Chodesh tov.
Mazel tov. Chodesh tov. Everything was beautiful.
Mazel tov. Mountain, England.
I'm so inspired by Yael and Shari. It was a terrific program.
As always.
Very well done.
Excellent.
Every time I attend one of these, I'm so choked up. I think I'm going to get used to it, and I don't.
Exactly how I feel.
So emotionally powerful.
Because it's not just another Siyum, it's a different Siyum.
True.
Yeah.
Right. True. Like every Siyum has had a different flavor.
Mazel tov, everyone.
Shari.
So wonderful.
Thank you.
Mazel tov, good chodesh to everyone. I'm now going to Mincha.
I'm going to go have breakfast. Bye.
Mazal tov, everybody.
This was,
thank you,
Michelle, no shiur.
No shiur tomorrow morning. Nope.
Okay.
Hazara day, not day off. Hazara day.
Catch up day. Catch up day.
Catch up day for those who need to catch up. Or
so don't forget to count Sphira tonight. My job. Don't forget to count Sphira.
You're confusing people.
Gita, what's that number again?
Well, in America, it's still 14. You guys should be up to 15.
Yeah, we were.
Can we get a preview? Can we get a preview of what 15 will look like?
You'll have to wait. Right, you'll miss 15.
Yeah.
This was wonderful. Are there any classes in Daf Yomi in English to delve behind what I'm reading?
You want an in-depth class of Daf Yomi?
Yeah, where, yes, I mean, it's one thing for me to read it. I would like to have something where I hear a discussion. I'm in the US of A.
So we have a daily Daf Yomi. Do you know about it?
Yes.
For more than that, you're saying.
Yes,
you want a class where people get together?
On Zoom, because I'm in Massachusetts. Zoom is perfect. I listen to you daily.
Everybody.
Mazel tov, Shari.